Nalanda Burns. 9-story libraries collapse. Palm leaf texts hiss into smoke. And across the Ganga heartland, Buddhism fades to a whisper. Later chronicles claim the embers smoldered for months. What's clear is the libraries were destroyed. 700 years of accumulated knowledge. Gone. This is what remains today. Crumbling red brick walls, empty halls, silence. And this is what happened to Buddhism across much of the Indian heartland. It almost vanished, not slowly, not quietly, but nearly completely. For 800 years, Buddhism dwindled to scattered pockets. The monasteries fell silent. The stupas crumbled. The teachings, culturally forgotten. How does a tradition that shaped an era almost vanish where it began? I'm Matt, and you're watching Buddha's Wisdom. Today, we're solving a mystery, a historical disappearance so complete that for centuries, much of the heartland had culturally forgotten its Buddhist past. But before we dive into how Buddhism almost died, we need to address something. Buddha was born in Lumbini, that's in modern-day Nepal, and Nepali viewers rightly take pride in this. The birthplace of the Buddha belongs to Nepal. No question. But this video isn't about where Buddhism was born. It's about where Buddhism became a world religion, and where it nearly disappeared. After his birth, Buddha spent his entire life teaching in the kingdoms of what we now call northern India. He attained enlightenment in Bodh Gaya. He gave his first sermon in Sarnath. He died in Kushinagar. He built his Sangha, his community, across the Indian kingdoms. No modern borders existed then, just kingdoms, republics, and tribal territories united by shared culture. So when we say Buddhism vanished from India, we mean the entire region, where it flourished for over 1,000 years, where it built universities, influenced kings, shaped philosophy, and sent missionaries to transform Asia. We're talking about the land where Buddhism grew from the teaching of one man into a religion that would change the world. And then, nearly lost that land completely. To understand how Buddhism almost died, we first need to see how alive it once was. Let's rewind. The year is 250 BCE. Emperor Ashoka sits on the throne of the Mauryan Empire, from Afghanistan to Bengal, from the Himalayas to Karnataka, all under his rule. And Ashoka's imperial patronage supercharges Buddhism. Stone edicts proclaiming the Dhamma across his empire. Missions to Sri Lanka, to Greece, to Egypt. Buddhist monks teaching in Alexandria, where Greek philosophy met Eastern wisdom for the first time. Stupas, monasteries, hospitals based on Buddhist principles of compassion. He broadcast ethics across his realm. But the effect was unmistakable. Buddhism had imperial backing, land grants, resources, prestige. If you watched our video on how Buddhism conquered without crusades or jihad, you saw how Buddhism spread through persuasion and royal support rather than violence. Ashoka perfected that model. Jump forward to 400 CE. You're standing at the entrance to Nalanda University. Around you, Chinese accounts describe thousands of students from across Asia studying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, logic, philosophy, and the Dhamma. The Chinese monk Xuanzang records traveling for 3 years, through the Taklamakan Desert, over the Pamir Mountains, through bandit-infested passes, to study here. He stayed 17 years. When he finally returned to China, he brought back 600 Sanskrit texts and spent the rest of his life translating them. 9-story libraries housing hundreds of thousands of texts. Debate halls seating thousands. An administrative system that would make modern universities jealous. Nalanda earned its reputation. Buddhism wasn't confined to the Indian subcontinent. It was the region's gift to the world. Monks carried the teachings to China, where they merged with Taoism to create Chan Buddhism, to Tibet, where they encountered the indigenous Bone religion and created Vajrayana, to Sri Lanka, where Theravada Buddhism preserved the Pali canon, to Southeast Asia, where massive temple complexes rose from the jungle, Borobudur in Java, Bagan in Myanmar, the stupas of Nakhon Pathom in Thailand, Anuradhapura, and Polonnaruwa in Sri Lanka. All of it flowing outward from the Indian kingdoms, the source, the origin. Centuries later, the Pala kings would keep this flame alive in Bengal and Bihar. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, rulers like Dharmapala and Devapala funded Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odantapuri. Buddhist universities remained centers of learning, even as other regions shifted. By 500 CE, Buddhism is everywhere across the northern kingdoms. Monasteries dot the landscape. Royal courts fund Buddhist institutions. Merchants donate to the Sangha, the Buddhist community. Pilgrims travel from kingdom to kingdom visiting sacred sites. This is the golden age. Buddhism is powerful, prestigious, seemingly untouchable. Buddhism controlled the region's intellectual life, its universities, its philosophy, its royal courts. Within 700 years, almost none of it would remain. The first clue to how this happened is hiding where you'd least expect it. Buddhism began as a jailbreak. 3 robes, 1 bowl, no property, no status. Siddhartha Gautama walked out of his palace, abandoned wealth, title, inheritance. He sat under a tree and refused to move until he understood the nature of dukkha, suffering. After his awakening, he established the Sangha with a radical idea. Monks own nothing. You walk from village to village with your hand out, accepting whatever food people offer. You sleep under trees. You own no property. You accumulate no wealth. Total renunciation, total dependence on the generosity of laypeople. This created a beautiful relationship. Monks remained humble, connected to ordinary life, reminded daily that they survived through the kindness of others. Laypeople felt connected to the Dhamma through their act of giving. That was the original vision. By 500 CE, Buddhist monasteries owned entire villages, thousands of acres of agricultural land. They collected rents. They hired servants. They possessed treasuries of gold and jewels donated by wealthy patrons. Monks didn't beg for food anymore. They had it delivered. Some monasteries functioned more like estates than spiritual communities. The monastic code, the Vinaya Pitaka, technically forbade monks from handling money. But by the middle period, complex workarounds had evolved. Stewards managed monastery finances. The monks technically didn't touch gold, but they controlled vast resources. And wealth. Wealth changes you. Success softens you. Prosperity makes you cautious. You stop taking risks because you have something to lose. Look at tech startups that preached, "Don't be evil," then optimized for profit. Success doesn't corrupt alone. Success makes you irrelevant. Early Buddhism challenged the Brahmin caste system. It welcomed outcasts and untouchables. It said wisdom matters more than birth, compassion more than ritual purity. Buddhism wasn't alone in this. Jainism and other Shramana movements were making similar critiques. But Buddhism's Sangha made it practical. Anyone could join. No caste restrictions, no wealth requirements. Dangerous. Radical. But by 500 CE, wealthy monasteries depended on donations from kings and merchants, many of whom had Brahmin advisors and observed caste distinctions. Challenging the system too aggressively might dry up the funding. So Buddhism softened, accommodated, became part of the establishment it once challenged, and the people noticed. Not consciously, perhaps, not all at once. But slowly the connection weakened. Buddhism began to feel like a religion of elites, of scholars, of wealthy merchants and royal courts, not of farmers, not of villages, not of the soil. But getting comfortable isn't enough to kill a religion. Plenty of wealthy religious institutions survive for centuries. There's more to this story. And the second clue reveals something brilliant. While Buddhism was getting comfortable, Hinduism was evolving. Hinduism faced a challenge around 500 to 600 CE. By 500 CE, Buddhist teachers had made ancient Indian ideas: ahimsa, meditation, compassion, ethical living, central and accessible. These concepts weren't invented by Buddhism. They existed in Vedic and Upanishadic traditions, in Jainism, across Indian philosophy for centuries. Buddhism's innovation was accessibility. You don't need a Brahmin priest to meditate. You don't need elaborate rituals to practice compassion. You don't need Sanskrit education to understand the path. You don't need to be born into the right caste to achieve spiritual realization. That accessibility, that's what made Buddhism powerful. And Hinduism watched this success. The response? The Bhakti movement. Between 600 to 1200 CE, Bhakti teachers created new forms within Hinduism. Personal devotion over complex ritual, direct experience over priestly mediation, emotional connection over intellectual complexity, accessible regional languages over Sanskrit exclusivity. Buddhism had shown there was enormous demand for accessible spirituality. Bhakti met that demand within Hindu frameworks. Bhakti saints composed poetry in Tamil, in Kannada, in Hindi and Bengali. They sang to Vishnu, to Shiva, to the Divine Mother. They said, "Divine love matters more than caste. Devotion matters more than ritual purity. Your heart matters more than your birth." You didn't need to leave Hinduism to access these ideas. Bhakti offered them within Hindu tradition, not copying, competing, evolving. And the exchange went both ways. Buddhist philosophy profoundly influenced Hindu thinkers like Shankara, whose Advaita Vedanta engaged deeply with Buddhist concepts. The dialogue was mutual, even if the power dynamics weren't equal. But then came the most consequential move. Around the 9th century CE, some Puranic texts began teaching that Buddha was actually Vishnu's 9th avatara, one of the 10 incarnations of the Preserver God. The story varies. Some Puranas praise him as a teacher of compassion. Others say he appeared to test the wicked by leading them away from Vedic sacrifice, making them weak so the gods could defeat them. Not every Hindu tradition accepted this framing. Many rejected it entirely. But in regions where it took hold, it blurred the boundary people felt between Buddhist and Hindu. You like Buddha? He's an avatara, he's part of the cosmic story. You want to worship Buddha? Come to this temple. We have a Buddha statue alongside other divine forms. You follow Buddha's teachings? Those truths fit within the broader Hindu understanding of reality. The boundary started to blur. Picture a village in 900 CE. A grandmother enters her local temple, lights incense before a Buddha statue. But she's using Hindu ritual gestures, chanting mantras that mix Sanskrit and Pali, offering flowers in the traditional Hindu way. And that is exactly how Buddhism began to disappear. Not through fighting, through merging, through boundaries becoming so porous that within a few generations, many people didn't remember there was supposed to be a distinction. Sometimes victory looks like disappearance, but wait. If Buddhism was being absorbed peacefully over centuries, if this was a slow, quiet disappearance through cultural merging, why did we open with a library on fire? What happened to Nalanda? Before we get to the fire, we need to understand why Buddhism was so vulnerable when the fire came. Buddhism had a problem from the very beginning. One it never solved: villages. Buddhism was always more popular in cities, with merchants who traveled trade routes and encountered different cultures, with educated elites who appreciated philosophical debate, with kings who needed an ideological alternative to Brahmin power. But villages? 90% of people in the region lived in villages. And villages belonged to Hinduism, not because Hinduism conquered them, because Hinduism was them. Hinduism wasn't just one religion, it was and is a family of traditions. Diverse, regional, adaptable. That diversity was its strength. In village life, Hinduism was the fabric of existence. Births, weddings, funerals, harvests. Every transition marked with ritual. Family lineages maintained by household priests. Local deities protecting specific wells, groves, fields. Buddhism offered wisdom. Hindu traditions supplied the festivals and family rites that defined village life. Buddhism offered monasticism. It asked you to leave home, shave your head, give up family life, join a monastery. For laypeople, it offered the Pancasila, the 5 precepts, and the opportunity to gain merit by supporting monks. And if you're wondering how karma and merit actually work, we covered that in another video. There were lay Buddhist communities and local shrines, but village ritual life leaned Hindu. Buddhist monks lived away from villages. They begged for food, received donations, taught the Dhamma when asked, but they didn't live there. They didn't become part of village life. Hindu Brahmins lived in villages. They performed the rituals. They were woven into the social structure. They were family. And there was another shift happening. The language of Buddhism was changing. Early Buddhism used Prakrit and Pali, languages ordinary people could understand. But in North Indian scholastic circles, Buddhist scholarship had shifted to scholastic Sanskrit. The gap between learned monks and lay people widened. Pali and Prakrit remained vital in Theravada regions, but in the northern heartland, the language drift created distance. If your monastery teaches in a language you don't speak, how connected can you feel? So village Buddhism was always thin, a layer of Buddhist practice over deep Hindu roots. We see this today. Political movements that win cities but lose rural areas. Technologies elites adopt while most people stick with familiar tools. Ideas that sound transformative in universities but don't translate to Main Street. If you can't reach the villages, you can't reach most people. As long as monasteries existed nearby, that layer persisted. Villagers could send sons to become monks. They could visit monasteries on holy days. They could hear Dhamma talks. But when the monasteries disappeared, picture it, your great-grandfather was Buddhist, regularly walked to the nearby monastery, took refuge in the Tiratana, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, tried to follow the 5 precepts, understood himself as a follower of the Buddha. Your grandfather did some Buddhist things, but the monastery closed when he was young. The monks scattered. So mostly he followed Hindu practices, because that's what the village priest knew. That's what the festivals celebrated. That's what his neighbors did. Your father doesn't remember the family being Buddhist, worships Hindu deities, celebrates Hindu festivals, follows Hindu customs. And you? You've never heard your family was Buddhist. That knowledge, gone. 3 generations, that was all. This is what historians call the quiet disappearance. No persecution, no forced conversions, no dramatic final stand. Forgetting. Like a song that slowly fades until you can't hear it anymore. In the heartland, endurance lives where the festivals live. Buddhism never fully owned those festivals. Now you understand why Buddhism was vulnerable. It had gotten comfortable. It had been absorbed through cultural adaptation. It had lost the villages. It had become fragile, brittle, dependent on institutions and royal patronage. What happened next was the final blow to a patient already dying. Before we continue, I need to say something. What I'm about to describe is complicated. This isn't a story with heroes and villains. This is history, messy, tragic, and far more complex than anyone wants to admit. Historian Richard Eaton spent decades on this question. What he found. Buddhism and the invasions are connected, but not how you'd think. Let me explain. By 1000 CE, Buddhism was already declining in most of the region, already being absorbed through cultural adaptation, already losing royal patronage. Buddhism had weathered invasions before. The White Huns, the Hephthalites, swept through northwestern territories in the 5th and 6th centuries, hitting monasteries hard. Buddhist communities recovered, but they never fully regained their strength in those regions. But Buddhism was still strong in Bihar and Bengal. The Pala Empire kept Nalanda functioning. Vikramashla and Odantapuri still attracted students from Tibet and Nepal. Buddhism was wounded, but not dead. Then came the invasions. Mahmud of Ghazni raids northern territories repeatedly between 1000 to 1027 CE. Muhammad of Ghor establishes the Delhi Sultanate in 1192 CE. And in 1193 CE, Bakhtiar Khalji's armies reach Nalanda. From a distance, Nalanda presents as a fortified, wealthy complex. High walls, large buildings, strategically located, resources stored inside. In medieval statecraft, large endowed complexes looked like state assets. They attack. Fire spreads through 9-story buildings packed with palm leaf manuscripts, books written on dried palm leaves coated with protective oils, incredibly flammable. Xuanzang had described Nalanda's library as so vast it took months to catalog. Texts from across the Buddhist world, commentaries, scientific treatises, mathematical discoveries, medical knowledge, poetry, philosophy, irreplaceable. And it burns. A Tibetan monk named Dharmasvaman visited in 1234, 40 years after the destruction. He found Nalanda abandoned. Walls still blackened by fire. A few elderly monks hiding in nearby villages, teaching in secret, preserving what they could remember. He wrote, "The entire place is deserted. Only one old monk remains, 90 years old, teaching a handful of students." That was all. Vikramashila Falls, Odantapuri Falls. Smaller monasteries throughout Bihar and Bengal, all destroyed or abandoned within a few decades. Now, pay attention, because this is critical. Why did Buddhism collapse after these invasions while Hinduism survived? Structure. Hindu worship was decentralized. Families worshipped at home. Small temples dotted every village. Priests lived among the people. Rituals could be performed anywhere. Destroy one temple, and 10 more remained. Kill one priest and his sons continued the lineage. Buddhism was centralized. Everything depended on monasteries. That's where the monks lived. That's where the texts were kept. That's where teachings were transmitted. That's where the community gathered. Destroy a Hindu temple? The Brahmin moves next door. Worship continues. Destroy a Buddhist monastery. You've destroyed the entire Buddhist infrastructure for that region. No more monks, no more texts, no more teachings, no more community. Over. If your classroom is also your bank, a fire closes both. But, and this is critical, the invasions didn't cause Buddhism to disappear. They delivered the final blow to a patient already dying. Why not this time? Because Buddhism wasn't strong anymore. When those institutions fell, Buddhism fell with them. The invasions didn't kill Buddhism. They revealed how vulnerable Buddhism had become. By 1200 CE, Buddhism still existed in isolated pockets. By 1400 CE, scattered communities in Bengal and Orissa. By 1700 CE, almost nothing. And by 1800 CE, Buddhism in the heartland was reduced to tiny pockets and memories. Small communities persisted in the northeast and Himalayan foothills. But for practical purposes in the Ganga Plain, almost entirely gone by approximately 1700 CE. The land where Buddhism flourished had nearly forgotten its own child. That could be the end. A civilization forgets its past. Buddhism becomes a footnote in regional history. But the wheel keeps turning. And in 1830, something unexpected happens. (1830s). British colonial administrators start mapping the region systematically. They stumble upon ruins, massive structures, clearly ancient, completely abandoned. Nobody knows what they are. Local villagers call them Hindu temples, because what else would they be? But the architecture looks different. Strange symbols, no Hindu deities. Curious. British archaeologist Alexander Cunningham begins excavating in 1861. He finds pillars with inscriptions in a script nobody can read anymore. He unearths massive stupas. He discovers Buddhism. Many in the heartland learn about their own Buddhist past through archaeological discoveries. Much of the culture had forgotten. Archaeology helped reassemble a story many communities had lost. By the late 1800s, Buddhism in the heartland is essentially dead. A few isolated communities in the far northeast. Some hidden practitioners in the Himalayas. But for practical purposes, gone. Then comes October 14th, 1956. Diksha Bhumi grounds, Nagpur. Estimates suggest between 380,000 and 600,000 people standing in rows under the open sky, and one man standing before them. Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, architect of the Indian Constitution, scholar of economics, lawyer, social reformer, and most importantly, a Dalit, an untouchable in the Hindu caste system. Ambedkar raises his hand. Hundreds of thousands of hands rise with him, and together they speak the ancient words. Buddham saranam gacchami, I take refuge in the Buddha. Dhammam saranam gacchami, I take refuge in the Dhamma. Sangham saranam gacchami, I take refuge in the Sangha. Not for philosophy, not for meditation, for dignity. Ambedkar understood something profound. The caste system wasn't economic oppression alone. It was spiritual violence. It told millions of people they were inherently polluted, inherently lesser, inherently unworthy. Hinduism, at least as practiced, was inseparable from caste. But Buddhism? Buddhism was born as a rejection of caste. The Buddha explicitly taught that birth doesn't determine worth, that wisdom and compassion matter infinitely more than lineage, that the lowest outcast who practices the Dhamma is nobler than the highest Brahmin who doesn't. So Ambedkar offered his community a choice. Stay in a religion that calls you untouchable, or join a religion that says everyone has Buddha nature. Ambedkar wrote, I like the religion that teaches liberty, equality, fraternity. For him, refuge was a civilizational reset. His 22 vows rejected caste practices and affirmed an ethical, modern Buddhism. Not a return to medieval monasticism, but a Buddhism for social transformation. Today, the 2011 census lists approximately 8.4 million Buddhists in India. Current estimates vary. Most follow Ambedkar's Navayana tradition. Buddhism didn't return as nostalgia, it returned as a revolution. Again. 3 years later, 1959. A 23-year-old Tibetan monk flees Chinese occupation. He crosses the Himalayas on foot, following paths through mountain passes so high that breathing becomes agony. He carries almost nothing. Robes, scriptures, the spiritual lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. He arrives in India, the land where Buddhism was born and nearly died. And he stays. The Dalai Lama establishes the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala. Tibetan refugees flood in. They build monasteries. They re-establish the great monastic universities, Sera, Drepung, Ganden, now in exile. They preserve their traditions. Buddhism had left the region as a refugee 800 years ago. Now it returns, as a refugee. The wheel keeps turning, and something beautiful is happening now. Indians are rediscovering Buddhism, not as a foreign import, not as something exotic from Tibet or Thailand or Japan, but as a lost inheritance, Bodh Gaya, where Buddha attained enlightenment. For centuries, non-Buddhist custodians oversaw it. A 1949 act formalized shared governance through the Bodh Gaya Temple Management Committee. Today, it welcomes over 500,000 pilgrims every year. Indians studying Buddhist philosophy at universities, meditation centers teaching Vipassana and Samatha, the government promoting Buddhist heritage sites. By 1900, many in the heartland thought Buddha was another name for Vishnu. They didn't know he was a historical person. They didn't know Buddhism had once been a distinct tradition in popular practice. Complete cultural amnesia. Buddhism nearly disappeared from the region for 800 years, but it never truly died. It went to China and became Chan, to Japan and became Zen, to Tibet and became Vajrayana, to Thailand and preserved the Pali Canon, to Sri Lanka and maintained the monastic lineage. Buddhism left and transformed the world. Maybe that's the most Buddhist thing that could have happened. So, we started with a mystery. How did Buddhism nearly vanish? We found 4 clues. First, Buddhism got comfortable. The monks who once begged for food became landlords. The revolutionaries became the establishment. The edge dulled. Second, Hinduism adapted brilliantly. Through the Bhakti movement, it offered accessible devotion within Hindu frameworks. Buddhism had shown the demand existed. Hinduism met that demand. And in some regions, Buddha was absorbed into Hindu cosmology as an avatara. The boundaries blurred until many people didn't remember there were supposed to be boundaries. Third, Buddhism never owned the villages. It was always more influential in cities with merchants, scholars, courts. Hinduism was the religion of the soil, and 90% of people lived in villages. Fourth, Buddhism was fragile, too centralized, too dependent on monasteries and royal patronage. When the monasteries fell, everything fell. When the institutions collapsed, the infrastructure disappeared. Put them together and Buddhism didn't stand a chance. But the real answer runs deeper. Ice and water, same essence, different form. When the temperature changed, Buddhism melted. Hindu traditions flowed, shapeless, impossible to destroy. Water absorbs heat, cold, everything around it, and water remembers. It carries trace elements wherever it flows. Buddhism didn't disappear, it transformed. Some of it evaporated into the air, floating to Tibet, to China, to Japan, to Southeast Asia, taking the Dhamma to cultures that had never heard it. Some dissolved into Hindu traditions, influencing philosophy, enriching practice in ways not always acknowledged. And now, some of that water is freezing back into ice, crystallizing, returning to its original form, different shape, same essence. The Dhamma is coming home. For 800 years, the heartland largely forgot Buddhism. No hatred drove this, no violence alone, no single catastrophe, just gentle, inevitable change. Through comfort that softened revolutionary edges, through cultural adaptation that blurred boundaries, through fragility that couldn't withstand storms, through roots that never reached deep enough. The library burned, but libraries can be rebuilt, teachings can be relearned, memory can return. Buddhism's near disappearance is one of history's great ironies. The religion that taught anicca, impermanence, experienced its own impermanence in the land where it flourished. The religion that taught anatta, non-attachment, got too attached to its institutions. The religion that taught adaptability failed to adapt. Until now. Because nothing is permanent, not even Buddhism's absence. The wheel keeps turning. What arises must pass away. What passes away can arise again. Buddhism left. Buddhism is returning. And maybe this time, it learned something from its 800-year journey around the world. This time, it won't make the same mistakes. This time, it's learning from villages, not ruling from monasteries. This time, it's decentralized, flexible, adapted to modernity. This time, it comes not as state religion but as personal practice, not as institution but as path. This time, it might stay. The library burned, but the Dhamma survived. And now, after 800 years, it's coming home. If this story changed how you see history, if it made you think about impermanence in a new way, hit that subscribe button. We've got more mysteries to solve, more untold stories to uncover, more ancient wisdom for modern lives. Vote in the comments. What was the bigger factor? Buddhist institutional dependence or the success of Hindu cultural adaptation? Let me know what you think. Drop a comment. Did you know Buddhism nearly disappeared from the heartland? What surprised you most? Until then, stay curious, stay wise, and remember, nothing lasts forever, not even endings.